Buonasera, siamo di nuovo qui con Liberi Oltre Confine e oggi vorremmo parlare un po' delle conseguenze politiche della pandemia, di come cioè la pandemia del Covid-19 ha influenzato e con tutta probabilità continuerà a influenzare i partiti politici, le posizioni che prendono, gli orientamenti anche internazionali, insomma le affinità che vengono rivendicate rispetto a diversi modelli politici e di contenimento del virus e più in generale di diciamo così, istituzioni e tentativi di gestire e orientare l'economia e la politica. Ne parliamo con un amico, con Steve Davies. Steve è uno storico, è a capo di tutta la parte education, cioè di tutta la parte che ha a che fare con le attività divulgative rivolte agli studenti dell'Institute of Economic Affairs a Londra, è autore di diversi libri. Il suo penultimo libro era un interessantissimo volume breve ma molto denso, dedicato alle diverse spiegazioni possibili di quel fenomeno unico e straordinario nella storia che è stata la rivoluzione industriale, quindi un tentativo di venire alle prese con le diverse concause che hanno portato al decollo industriale dell'Occidente. Il suo ultimo libro invece si intitola The Politics and Economics of Brexit e ciò che ci interessa in realtà è soprattutto il sottotitolo, cioè The Realignment of British Public Life. Steve per alcuni anni è andato ragionando proprio sul riallineamento dei partiti politici e delle posizioni, anche delle posture, delle culture politiche nel mondo anglosassone. Quindi cercheremo di ragionare assieme proprio su questo tema. Steve, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, Alberto. Good to be with you.
Well, I was mentioning the title of your last book and the reference to the realignment of British public life. You've been studying this subject for quite a while. You've been thinking about it. And, realignment of British political parties is something relatively rare. I mean, the last time it happened, it was the 1920s with Stanley Baldwin and the Labour Party basically taking the place of liberals as the alternative to the Tory party. But we've been seeing signals in the last few years that the beliefs associated with this or that political culture were changing. And in particular, that the, so to say, available alliances for people of a classical liberal persuasion were changing as well. So I would like to start by asking you, how was the British and perhaps American too public sphere evolving? I mean, what was the direction it seemed to have taken before the pandemic?
Well, the essential argument is that before the pandemic, what we were seeing was a shift in what was the main dividing issue in politics, and that is what a political realignment is. An alignment, because you can't have a realignment without an alignment in the first place, an alignment is a situation which you normally have in politics where, although people disagree about lots of things, there is just one or two big issues that really matter to them, people in general, that is. And those issues are the ones that they use to decide which side they're on, which team they're on. And so there is one aligning issue and usually a secondary aligning issue, and people decide what their political identity is by virtue of their position on that big issue. Now, what happens with the realignment is that the main issue that divides politics changes. Now, major realignments are where the primary aligning issue changes. Secondary alignments, like the one that we actually had in Britain in the 1970s, really, that's one where the secondary aligning issue changes. The more profound ones are the ones where the primary aligning issue changes, like the 1920s, for example. And this is what has happened in Britain, because the primary aligning issue up until the pandemic's, up until really 2015 maybe, was economics. It was basically, were you on the free market side or did you favour government intervention? And you had a kind of spectrum ranging from complete communists at one end to radical anarcho-capitalists at the other end. That was the big aligning issue, and people defined themselves by that. There was a secondary aligning issue, though, about social liberalism, but that one became exhausted because basically the social liberals won the argument. There are still a few hardcore idiots, I would say, who adhere to the kind of strong social conservatism, but they were a fringe. Now, what has happened is that that secondary aligning issue has now become folded into a new one, which is now the main aligning issue, and that is identity, basically, and a contrast between global, dynamic, open capitalism, if you will, or broadly defined market economy on the one hand, and a much more what I've called national collectivism on the other side, a kind of politics that emphasizes the need to use political power to sustain and nurture very discrete, particular local identities, and to resist the corrosive effect, supposedly, of global cosmopolitan finance, business, and the like. And it's a kind of politics that combines actually left-wing economics with cultural traditionalism. And it's the politics of the AfD, of Signor Salvini, of Vox in Spain, of the RN in France, the AfD. You can list all the usual suspects here, certainly Viktor Orban and of Kaczynski as well. It's very much their position. Parties of this kind often start off as being free markets. And so their position initially is often free markets, but only in one country at a time, kind of thing. It's a kind of, capitalism in one country, to adapt a well-known phrase. But because of electoral logic, they find that they have to move to the left on economics away from free markets, because the voters they find who want to vote for them are people, typically older working class voters, who are also well to the left of centre on the old economic end. So we were moving before the pandemic, I would argue, from a world in which economics was the main aligning issue into a world in which, although economics still mattered, it was no longer the primary division. The primary division was increasingly this division between cosmopolitan globalism and local nationalism. And it was focused increasingly on identity, which means that questions like free movement of capital, free movement of labour, immigration, in other words, these were becoming the big flashpoint issues.
Well, the process you describe, I think, is really fits, for example, the Northern League. I mean, the Northern League
Yes.
used to be a pretty free market party, particularly when it was established in the 80s. But then, ever since Mr. Salvini took over in, I think it was 2011, 2012, well, the party was basically dying back then, and Salvini rejuvenated it and brought it to be, one of the biggest parties in the country by investing everything on identity politics and fear of immigration. It's interesting that this kind of process went on also in other countries, but with different speed. It was apparently very fast in Germany with AfD. I mean, AfD was established as a party of economists, but then it became, so the idea was to voice some perplexities about the ECB monetary policy, basically, and then they became an anti-immigration party. And when it comes to Vox, perhaps it's a bit different. I'm talking about the countries I sort of know vaguely. Vox is a bit different because Vox still has some sort of free market platform when it comes to economics. But of course, also Vox is a bit different when it comes to immigration, because it is, being Spain, and therefore having this gigantic number of potentially, relatively cultural homogeneous migrants. Vox is welcoming them against the others. So it's making really of immigration more of a issue related with hispanidad than anything else. But indeed, this process went on in different parties, and of course, I think perhaps you met in his libertarian days Mr. Orban, who used to be, as the head of Fidesz, I remember, quite a free market type.
Indeed, and then he lost an election and decided that that was not the way to electoral success, and he reinvented himself as fascism light, basically, which is what he's been on ever since. And you're quite right. I mean, there is obviously national variation, and in Spain, what you've got in Vox is the assertion of a particular vision of Spanish identity, Hispanidad, isn't it, which is the vision of both Castilianism as the core of Spanish identity, as opposed to those wretched Catalans and Basques and so on, but also, of course, of the wider Hispanic world. And so, yes, but it's ultimately the same thing, though. It's an assertion of a kind of national as opposed to a global identity. It's just that in this case, the identity is one which, because of Spain's history, has this kind of outreach to certain parts of the world, but at the expense of others. The same is true in Britain, by the way, because the Conservative Party has done two things. One is it has moved to the, particularly first under Theresa May, actually, and then under Boris Johnson as well. It has moved quite significantly to the left on economics. So I think the idea that the Tory party is the party of radical free markets is just not true anymore, and hasn't been true for quite some time. It's very much committed to a kind of project of national renewal and national development, levelling up, as the stock phrase has it. We because of the pandemic, we don't know exactly what form this will take, but we can suspect it's going to be an industrial policy. Now that we've left the EU single market, there's all sorts of talk. There's a bill going through Parliament at the moment, which is all about giving the government the power to subsidise industries, to give, special assistance to sectors and things that they want to promote. So economic, an economic development state of the South Korean style. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it is that what it's asserting, and this is quite important in the British context, is a particular notion of British identity. And the British identity, just like that Castilian Spanish identity that Vox promote, is an imperial identity, because it was formed in the 1880s by redefining Britain as an imperial state and the core of this global entity, the British Empire. And so, as well as, so it isn't just saying, oh, no, we don't want to have any connection with foreigners. It's not Little Englandism. What it is rather is the idea that, well, we have closer relations with Canadians and Australians, or indeed Indians and Nigerians, than we do with those lesser breeds across the channel. And so it's not a matter of being straightforwardly opposed to immigration. It's a matter of having relations with the former parts of the empire, basically, including, as I say, India, Pakistan, even Malaysia, large parts of Africa, and obviously the white Commonwealth. So that's the kind of British identity that's being asserted in this shift. And as with Vox, it makes the whole kind of globalism versus nationalism seem a bit more complicated, but it makes sense when you realize that the nationalism, the national identity that's being asserted, is an imperial one, which derives a lot of its content and view of the world from the history and legacy of the British Empire.
That sort of element in conservative politics perhaps was always there. I do remember, I think it was Mrs. Thatcher's strange last book, Statescraft, that mentioned this idea of an Anglosphere. It was basically another version of the British Empire, with a different name, and perhaps with the Queen claiming a bit less from her colonies than in the past. But it seems to me that what changed with Brexit, and I suppose, but I'd like, of course, to hear your much sounder views, I suppose that was basically voters driven. What changed was the economic approach, because in a sense, I suppose that quite a few Brexiters, and we may know some of them, started campaigning against, intrusive European regulation and that sort of stuff, or social Europe, etc., etc. Or, by the way, European industrial policy, or debt mutualization. But they ended up instead voicing, a kind of protectionism in favor of what have been called, the somewheres vis-a-vis the anywheres by David Goodhart.
Yeah, precisely. And I mean, I was on record, and you can find me on record on video and elsewhere, before the Brexit referendum, while it was going on, saying that this is what was going to happen. and that the idea that Brexit was all about creating a kind of Hong Kong offshore of Europe was a total fantasy, and that libertarians who thought they were going to get this were disappointed, would be very disappointed, and also that people on the left who feared this as a nightmare, they should wake up, that this wasn't going to happen, something else was going to happen, my nightmare actually. And so what has happened is that people have said, yes, we want to get away from these intrusive European regulations so we can have even more intrusive regulations, but ones that we've made. Basically, that's the kind of difference that we've got. So yes, there has been this quite remarkable shift, really, which I think is going to continue. My point is obviously, there is a temptation to think that maybe what the pandemic has done is to check this realignment and to reassert the importance of the old economic axis. But I think that actually it's going to, if anything, intensify the realignment, mainly because of the impact that it's going to have, I predict, in the next couple of years on the left of politics, the non-national collectivist type of politics, certainly in the United States, and also I think in the UK, and also probably in other parts of Europe. So I think we're going to see, there is going to be a sudden resurgence in the next 3 or 4 years of various economic issues. But I think that, you'll no doubt want me to elaborate on this, but I think that what is going to happen is that a lot of those economic issues are going to be captured by the national collectivist side. And that they are going to have a particular vision of how to respond to the crisis that I believe we're going to be in about a couple of years' time at most.
So let's I will ask you to elaborate on that, but before, only one point. This relationship between the left and the right, of course. For the student of politics, right and left are sometimes more ambiguous than explanatory words.
Yeah.
In a sense, I think it is fair to say that when it comes to identity politics, we've seen at least as much identity politics on the left than we've seen on the right. Of course, it was a different identity. In many ways, if I think about Italy, identity politics started on the left, because since the left was left without, the polar star of socialism, at the end of the day, they needed to find other values in society, and they basically found their own version of civil rights, which is civil rights plus special privileges, let's put it this way. But they wanted to be the champion of alternative lifestyles, gay people, migrants, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, the identity politics of the right has a bigger market, at least for the time being, than the identity politics of the left. So how do you see, how do you see the left in the pandemic? Because of course, people in government had similar issues, but was there a difference, a divide between leftists and right-wingers in these circumstances?
In the pandemic, you mean? No. I think that the governments all over the world have just been trying to catch up with the constant pace of events and the mutations of the virus. So very few governments during the pandemic have given even the slightest impression that they're in charge of events. There have maybe been a few which have shown swift decision-making, competence and decisiveness, and actually given a clear impression that they know what they're doing and they're on top of things. Taiwan, maybe Australia, maybe New Zealand.
Maybe Singapore, but of course in Singapore, left and right are not very important.
That's about it, really. And Vietnam as well. But that doesn't map straightforwardly onto ideology. And a lot of it also has to do with geographical location. Countries that were in the greater Far East, if you will, did have an advantage of being quite close to the original epicenter of the outbreak. And that meant that they could react quickly. Whereas countries like Italy or Britain or anywhere in Europe, or indeed the United States, by the time people cottoned on to the fact that there was a serious problem, that this virus had gotten out all around the world, which was delayed because of the incredible obfuscation and lying of the Chinese authorities. By the time they realized this and the virus had arrived at a ski resort in Austria and then, dispersed from there all over Europe, it was too late. You couldn't take the kind of decisive action that New Zealand and Taiwan had taken because the virus was already loose. And at that point, a whole lot of things that would work before that point no longer work. And so ever since then, governments have just been frantically scrambling to try and catch up with this extremely subtle and dangerous opponent, which it emerged very rapidly, has a different ability to flu, which is the ability to completely crash and collapse modern hospital systems. And that was the thing that really led to mass panic on the part of both politicians and the medics, and led to the lockdowns, because the fear, I think well-founded in some cases, as we saw in Lombardy last year, is that it will lead to a complete breakdown or collapse of the hospital system. So I think there's been no distinction between left and right as far as dealing with the pandemic is concerned, simply because it hasn't yet, there wasn't an ideological response that you could clearly map onto left or right, saying, oh, this is what this is, and this is what we should do about it. The response was pretty much everywhere the same, which was pump tons of money into the economy, create various mechanisms for trying to preserve the supply side of the economy, impose major restrictions on all kinds of activity, put the economy into deep freeze, basically, a kind of protective coma, as you would say in medical terms, in order to try and limit the effect of the virus, but at the same time keep as much of the economy as alive as possible. And this was done regardless, really, of the ideology of the government in power. And there was obviously disagreements and arguments about the details, but you can't map those clearly onto a left or right spectrum, I think.
You mentioned 2 points. Pump a massive amount of money into the economy and impose major restriction, including on people's mobility. I mean, beginning with people's mobility. That somehow, I think, look far more legitimate in the public opinion today than 5 years ago. I mean, it's almost impossible to find anybody being even moderately skeptical about public spending on the right. And when it comes to the left, of course, it's far more difficult to argue for open borders or some more liberal policy on migration, because basically borders have become, an instrument in controlling contagion.
Precisely, yes.
Yeah. So, do you think this is going to have some, long-term consequences? Is that changing the agenda of the right and the left?
Definitely. And I think this is why I think what the pandemic will do is to actually further accelerate and deepen the realignment that was underway for, in many cases, about a decade before the pandemic arrived on our shores. Because I think there hasn't been, as I said, a real ideological division while the pandemic was going on. But I think there is going to be a big ideological division emerging over what lessons should we draw from it and how should we go on from here. And you've highlighted, I think, two of the for me, very unfortunate lessons that a lot of people are going to draw, which is why I think the national collectivist right is going to try and take advantage of this, in many cases will. One is the fact that, as you say, the idea that governments should be frugal, not spend money willy-nilly, seems to have just died a death. The idea of austerity or fiscal prudence seems to just be one for the birds now. The only real argument now is over what should the money be spent on. In other words, there's a kind of apparent consensus that you need a lot more public spending, a larger role for government money in the economy, but the division is over what should you use it for? What kind of ends should that active government be diverted to? And then on the other hand, there's a sudden re-emergence or reassertion of the importance of national governments, because transnational institutions like the WHO, the EU, have not covered themselves in glory during the pandemic. Governments at the national level may have, mad missteps, often have done, there's been major balls-ups, but they've still shown the capacity to act, and often in a timely manner, which the supranational organizations have not. And I think in the case of things like the WHO, it has laid bare the fundamental problem with that model of supranational institutions, which is that it's ultimately composed of and dependent upon sovereign states. And a sovereign state, by definition, has no higher authority. And so the WHO has no real, is powerless ultimately, and has no really effective capacity to act. It can only act to the degree that its powerful members and funders, like China and also the US, allow it to. And so I think that what this has done is to severely weaken the credibility of the kind of rules-based international order that has really been created and built up piece by piece, largely under the American aegis, since really the Bretton Woods Conference, and certainly since the creation of GATT in 1948. And that whole order, I think, is coming under terrific pressure. And we can see a very clear sort of geopolitical movement towards a more multipolar world, the breakdown of a lot of the trade system. And I think that what's going to happen in the next couple of years is going to intensify this dramatically, because governments during the pandemic, one of the responses, which was done with no real controversy anywhere, has been to engage in the biggest creation of money out of thin air in peacetime ever in the whole of history, particularly in the United States, but not only in the United States. And people say, well, yeah, we've had QE for, since 2008. But there's a crucial difference, it seems to me. If you look at the expansion of the money supply under quantitative easing after 2008, it was basically M0 and M1, M1 in particular, that was expanded. It was base money that was expanded. And all that money was pumped directly into the financial system. And its main purpose was to re-liquidate and refinance the banks, and also to hold up asset prices, while at the same time depressing long-term interest rates by inverting the yield curve. And the theory was this would lead people to borrow more money. It didn't work out, because all that money stayed inside the financial system or was used by the rich to bid up the value of assets. And it hasn't created any kind of general economic growth. Now, what has happened in the pandemic is that we've seen an enormous expansion, as I say, absolutely unprecedented in peacetime, of broad money, because the money was used to fund things like furlough schemes, income support schemes for people who then saved up all this money. We've had a massive expansion of M4. Now, if you look at standard quantity theory money predicts that once the velocity of money returns to normal, that you will have, or as it returns to normal rather, you're going to have pretty severe inflation. And there's a very good chance that that inflation will become entrenched because of the effect it has on expectations and economic decision making. And we can see this happening already. In the United States, it was announced 2 days ago, I think it was, that the inflation rate in the last month was 0.9%. It's pretty clear that on current trends, inflation in the United States is going to be at close to double-digit levels, or even in double-digit levels, by the end of this year. In the United Kingdom, last month, we had year-on-year inflation of just over 2%. The first time the 2% limit has been breached for well over a decade. And now I would expect by the end of this year that in Britain, we will have inflation of about 6 to 7% at least. And the same story is going to be true throughout the Eurozone. Now, that is going to cause huge problems, not least because it's associated with continuing asset price inflation and also severe and quite marked tightening in the labour market. For various reasons, the pandemic has accentuated various structural reorganizations in the economy. And one of the effects of these, which I think nobody really anticipated, I certainly didn't, is that it has significantly strengthened the bargaining power of labour as opposed to capital, of workers as opposed to employers. And so you're going to get sustained upward pressure on wages in many economies. And this means, I think, that at the moment, the central banks who were a year ago saying, oh, the pandemic is going to be deflationary, are now saying, yes, well, we are going to have inflation, but only a little bit. And I think their fallback position beyond that is, yes, we are going to have inflation, really quite big actually, but it's only going to last for about a year. It's going to be a spike. But I think that the longer this goes on, the more difficult it will be to hold the line. And sooner or later, they will have to raise interest rates. And when they do that, a whole gigantic flock of chickens are going to come home to roost, because there is a massive amount of bad debt out there. Not so much government debt. I'm not actually that worried about government debt, but corporate and household debt, particularly corporate debt. There is an enormous amount of high yield, high risk corporate paper out there, which is only being traded and is only viable because of unprecedentedly high levels of liquidity and negative real interest rates. And if that ceases to be the case, there'll be all hell to pay. And now the question then is, what do you do? And I think one response, which is the one that the national collectivists, I think, are going to make, is this is the time to do things like think about reimposing capital controls, bring back money control very much under the control of national governments, try to weaken links between your own currency and the dollar, because there will be a widespread perception, I think, that this global inflation, because it will be global, is coming from the United States. because the United States has decided to really take advantage of the fact that they have the world's reserve currency and spend like there is not only no tomorrow, but no next century. And I think that a lot of other countries are going to think, well, to hell with this. Why should we have be importing tons of inflation into our economy because of the way the feckless Americans are behaving? And so you will get a big assertion, I'm afraid, of economic nationalism. On the counter side, though, I think this is going to lead to massive ructions on the left, and it will lead to a kind of enormous division appearing in the left on the basis of how to respond to this. And I think what I predict is going to happen is there's going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight in most countries, certainly in the United States, between what you might call the liberal left and the radical left. And it'll be a very interesting question as to which one comes out on top.
Well, in our country, for example, the liberal left is no more. It's quite an interesting phenomenon, but the Democratic Party has been somehow pushed by its leadership to move to the left of the Five-Star Movement.
Right.
It's an old idea in Italian left-wing politics that you should never have an enemy to your left, and for this reason you need to be as extreme as they are. But also, I think it is something that relates with the role of intellectuals. I mean, now the intellectual stars of the left are, really leftist. I mean, it's no longer the time of the Larry Summers of this world. Even Paul Krugman looks like a moderate, as opposed to intellectual stars within the left. And of course, the left is typically more permeable to intellectual movement than the right is, at least in Italy. I mean, you may say many things about Mr. Salvini or Ms. Meloni, but you cannot say that their politics is influenced by books. When it comes to left-wingers, I think the situation is different, and they, even organized minorities on Twitter, for example, of committed left of center intellectuals, are now making, they're making ridiculous accusations like, the Draghi government being neoliberal. It's the government which is spending more money in the history of the Republic in some sense. How can it be neoliberal? So you basically see in the next couple of years, a day of reckoning for international organization. How does the EU fit in this picture? Because in some ways, I mean, not necessarily in ways I would approve, but clearly in the pandemic, with this sort of, partial mutualization of debt, with issuing bonds, with the ECB being more and more a central institution for all member states, the EU has made an interesting step towards full-fledged sovereignty.
I think this is true, and I think that in a way, this is one of those things that the pandemic has accelerated, which was going to go on anyway, because following the Maastricht Treaty, I mean, as pretty much every economist on the planet told the people at Maastricht when they were creating the euro, there's a fundamental problem with having a single currency in an area which is not a natural single currency area if you don't then have a single government. Now, interestingly, Robert Mundell, who recently died, of course, the originator of single optimal currency area theory, he actually supported the euro, but he supported it because he thought of it as a kind of supranational equivalent of the gold standard that would restrict elected politicians' propensity to give the electors what they wanted, i.e.
For a little while it was that. I mean, yes, now it's indeed. No longer, but for a little while it was
precisely, that. That's what it was. The thing is, though, it turns out that he was wrong, and all the other economists, Paul Krugman, Milton Friedman, pretty much a galaxy of economists from across the political spectrum all said that the euro was a really bad idea, and it was going to have disastrous results because of the fact that there wasn't the infrastructure, the political union that you required for such a currency. And I think that therefore, ever since Maastricht, and with all the recurring crises, it's becoming increasingly clear that as Emmanuel Macron, for example, said very clearly, either you give up the euro or you have to move towards a much greater degree of fiscal union and effectively the creation of something like a sovereign central power in the EU that has tax and spending powers so that it can adjust for exogenous shocks with differential effects, which is the classic problem that you need to adjust for in a single currency. Now, what the pandemic has done is massively accelerate that, as you just said a moment ago. And I think that this is going to continue after the pandemic, not least because the global monetary crisis, which I anticipate happening in about 18 months' time, is obviously going to play out in terms of the Eurozone. Quite how, who knows, impossible to predict, but you can be pretty sure it's going to cause some major bust up. Now, at this point, a lot of there are three kind of some people in the EU, of whom I think the outgoing Angela Merkel is the prime figure, think that the thing to do is just try and keep the show on the road. But I think that they are going to be fine. It's going to become impossible to maintain that position. And then you'll have people like Macron and others, Draghi as well, saying, well, look, what we need to do is to, push even further and create something like a EU sovereignty. But then there's going to be big pushback from Orban and Kaczynski and others who will say, no, this is undermining national sovereignty. And they'll have better to do with it. And of course, this will require a treaty change, which they can veto. So if you are Macron, what do you do? And I think it's already clear what he's going to do because he's shifted his rhetoric and his arguments in this regard. What they will do is they'll say, okay, we need a single European kind of political entity, but what we will have to do is to create a European demos, a solid European identity of which unites all the different national identities. And I think it's already clear what that national identity will be. It will be defined partly in negative terms. It will be to say that Europe is historically Christian, i.e. not Muslim, also not Jewish, by the way, but mainly not Muslim. Secondly, that it's historically white, i.e. not African or South Asian. And thirdly, and I think this will become very important, that it's not American, that it's defined in opposition to the culture and other aspects of the United States. Now, the interesting question, the fourth will be, is it going to also be defined as not Russian? Or are we going to go down the route of Eurasianism and say that there's some kind of fundamental similarity between Russian Orthodox Europe and, the Russia and the Balkans, basically? Or are they actually sufficiently different? But I think that's the kind of grand compromise that I think will be probably arrived at in the EU between the two poles. On the one hand, as I say, Orban, Kaczynski, and all the other parties like them in Europe, maybe Marine Le Pen, ultimately, who knows what's going to happen in the election. And on the other side, what you might call the more liberal people who want to push towards a more slightly left liberal kind of, structure in the EU. Now, there are going to be other people around, as well as the people who think, oh no, we don't want to change, we just want to keep the show on the road as it is, which is going to become an increasingly untenable position. There are also going to be the radical left, people like Yanis Varoufakis and the kind of left-wing intellectuals you mentioned, who are, as you say, increasingly prominent and increasingly influential. And their argument will be, yes, we do need to have closer integration, but not one that makes compromises with the Orbans and the Hungarians and the Poles and Slovaks and the other East Europeans. And the interesting question is which side. So the interesting question is who will support that, if any. And then mainly there might be a few lone classical liberals who will have to decide which side they go with, which will become a very difficult choice, I think. So I think that is what's going to happen in Europe. I expect the next 3 or 4 years to be very exciting. And I think I would bet at the moment, not overwhelmingly, but I would bet that ultimately some kind of pool sovereignty of a quite robust form will be achieved, because the alternative, as Macron has said, and I agree with him with this, is for the euro to collapse ultimately, sooner or later. There will be some major crisis that the ECB can't handle, maybe caused by Italy, could be somewhere else. And at that point, the euro will break down. And because the post-Maastricht EU is so closely tied to the single currency, if that fails, the whole project is probably going to fail. And I think confronted with that likelihood or prospect, a lot of people will make a lot of big compromises on several sides, actually. And that's why I would predict that's the outcome.
That's a very interesting scenario. So basically, you say a pool identity, which indeed has some elements of national collectivism, in which
Yeah.
somehow, national collectivism is the way in which you pay left-wing economics, the way in which you pay for left-wing economics. So, let's be more redistribution and more whiteness at the same
but
time.
redistribution within a particular national framework.
Yeah.
And also strict control of the borders of that international framework so that you don't get these, unwelcome guests, shall we say. And also, so on a kind of exclusionary notion, and also crucially, pulling out of the global financial, or not completely, obviously, because that's impractical, but withdrawing to a great degree from a kind of global architecture of international finance. The world monetary system as it is at the moment, dominated by the dollar, of course, and the global trade system that has been built up since GATT. And so and the point is, there are, with the growing trade war between the US and China, which Biden has continued. I mean, he's basically continued Trump's policy, no real change in this regard. And the growing geopolitical tensions between the US and China, and increasingly other parts of the world in China, such as India, for example, and also the EU to some degree, despite the Germans' efforts to, limit this growing tension. I can see the world, the world order. I think the big challenge for international liberals in many ways is, do we fight to save the international rules-based order, or do we, as I think we should actually, accept that it's come to the end of its life? But then you do not want to go into a world of either autarkic nationalism or competing, imperial blocs. That neither of those is at all a good prospect for all sorts of reasons, not least because historically this has always ended up in one place, which is major wars. And so you want to find, you have to come up with, I think, a different form of liberal international or globalism. And this is, I think, a really big intellectual project that liberal scholars and intellectuals need to be working on now.
Yes, and also, you mentioned imperial blocs, but in many ways, it's very difficult to have an empire without what Benjamin Constant called a neutral power, without a king. I think empires are always run by bureaucracies, by functionaries, but the presence of a king gives a certain degree of stability. And instead, even a democratic king, like in the United States, which is changing once every 8 years, may introduce strong elements of instability. And we know by experience, how dreadful American foreign policy choices have been. Anytime the US was called to exercise an imperial role. Let's move briefly to the Anglo-Saxon world. So England and the United States. How are parties changing in these countries? Is somehow Biden going to be close to the Macron model you envision? So is he going to be pretty much of a statist? Of course, he has BLM and a different climate when it comes to race and civil rights issues. But he may be cracking down on immigration too, following once again in Trump's footsteps.
I think that's exactly right. That is exactly what he is clearly doing. And I think if you look at the Democratic Party at the moment, and things like the absolutely massive stimulus bill that just passed the Senate yesterday, plus the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve, what you can see is something which is like Macron with a lot of knobs on, basically. So it's a combination of a kind of active social democratic or left liberal state. So it's a market economy, but with a very active role for government, a lot of government spending, very hands-on government monetary policy, things of this sort. But it's combined with a continuation of Trump's policy in terms of relations with China, and increasingly also immigration. And the development or the attempt to articulate a more inclusive and clear form of American national identity. Now, Biden's problem is he's facing that there's two things going on, but it's not his problem, but there's two things going on at the moment, I think, which are going to start becoming more and more apparent as in the near future. One of them is in the Democratic Party, just as you described in Italy, The intellectual energy and the organizational ability and capacity at ground level, grassroots level, is coming from the radical left. And so you have an emergent and very vocal, very active radical left in the United States with a lot of support from, if I may say so, the younger children of the elite, basically. It's an elite faction, as revolutionary factions usually are. They always come from above revolutions. And this group wants to push Biden in a much more and the whole Democratic Party in a much more state-controlled economy direction. They also want much more radical action on climate change and things of that sort than he is. Even he has done, because despite the Green New Deal, they wanted to go a lot further. On the other hand, these people don't have the money. And there is what you might call the mainstream of the Democratic Party, which is bankrolled and funded by a number of very large, powerful political investor groups. Silicon Valley, the whole international financial sector, which overwhelmingly has abandoned the Republicans, by the way. Hard to find a single person in finance in New York who was prepared to support Trump. They've all basically switched to the Democrats, and they're all donating to the Democrats now. So all of the highly globally interconnected parts of American commerce and business are also in the Democrats now. And so there's going to be a huge tug of war, I think, within the Democrat coalition between the radical left side and this more kind of, it'll be described inevitably as centrist, but I think actually that's a bit misleading. It's more a certain kind of left liberalism. Now, meanwhile, what's going on in the Republican Party? And what I think has become very apparent in the last few months in various fora and other places is that the Trump virus has completely taken over the Republican Party. It has become a Trump party. Whether regardless of what happens to the man himself, that kind of politics, that kind of rhetoric, that kind of ideology now dominates the party. And there may be lots of professional politicians there who secretly, do not think this, but that's what they've got to say if they're going to win a primary election, or indeed in many cases a general election, because that's where the bulk of the Republicans' constituency is. And so the Republicans are developing ever more rapidly into the kind of party that people like Hawley want, Senator Hawley, that is, a party of quite radical economic nationalism, essentially a Hamiltonian party in the American context. Now, the thing is, what are the free market donors and politicians in the Republican Party going to do? Do they actually sort of think, no, we haven't lost this battle yet, and continue fighting the fights? The trouble is, all the indications are they're dying on a hill if they do that. They really lost that cause. The other alternative, of course, is to now join the Democrats and to try and pull the Democrats slightly more in a free market direction, but also to ally with the centrist Democrats against the radical left. And if you're a Democratic politician, this then raises a very interesting question, because those kind of Republicans, that's a major block of both donors and voters in basically suburban metropolitan America. And so if you can get them on side, you've pretty much got the system locked up. You've become the predominant majority party. But on the other hand, to get them on board, you've got to piss off, and publicly piss off, this radical activist left movement that you've got, which is now sufficiently large and has enough influential figures that you probably can't do that. So what I predict in the next couple of years is a spectacular row in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party's position as a revolutionary nationalist party, basically becoming much more clearly established. So I think that's what's going to happen in the US. Now, in the British case, well, the British Conservative Party, what it did was, when it elected Boris Johnson as leader, it shifted quite decisively, as it had done already to some extent under Theresa May, in the national collectivist direction, to try and get voters from the economically interventionist but also conservative, socially conservative and nationalist quadrant. And that paid dividends for them, because they won all those seats in the north of England by switching and flipping a whole lot of working class ex-Labour, or in many cases ex-non-voting voters in their direction. The problem is that by doing this, they piss off a lot of free market and slightly conservative, but broadly liberal voters in the southeast. Now, they didn't lose those voters in large numbers in the last election because Jeremy Corbyn. They weren't going to vote Labour because the alternative to Boris Johnson was Jeremy Corbyn. Now, that's no longer true. And so the challenge for the Conservatives now is that they are finding that on the one hand, their free market wing, of whom there are still some, are increasingly unhappy with the kind of lavish spending and frantic money creation that's going on. And at the same time, they're not happy with a lot of other people, including in some cases the same people, are not happy with the sort of nationalist gesture politics that we've got going on, in which the English football team has recently played a major part, has to be said. And this sort of tension is going to become more marked. Now, one of the reasons why it's going to express itself quite interestingly is that Boris Johnson himself, I don't think he has any firm or definite beliefs. He has instincts, and I think the instincts are broadly libertarian, but his only real firm belief is I should be prime minister. And he believes that passionately, although he is probably increasingly wondering, well, now I am prime minister, what do I want to do? And I'm not sure he knows what the answer to that is, apart from have a good time, if possible, which he's not been able to have. And so the thing is, unlike when Thatcher became leader and the Tory party made a major shift, they don't have a leader who is committed to that major shift and is prepared to ram it through and force it through. And what I think is likely to happen, and this is like very vague speculation, is that I think probably the government will aim to have an election in the autumn of 2022. About 18 months from now. October 2022 is my guess. The reason is because they can tell that there's a lot of trouble coming in and they want to get the general election out of the way before that happens. And at that point, I think, let's say the Conservatives win it, I would not be taught by so Boris Johnson doesn't then stop being Prime Minister very soon. And we'll then have a big fight within the Conservative Party in this case to see whether it pursues the route of national collectivism and levelling up, or whether it goes back the other way. That will be quite a fraught fight, but I would predict the national collectivist side will win it. But it'll be interesting to see who emerges as the key standard bearers of the party for the different things, because at the moment, all of that kind of politicking has been stopped because, well, actually, to be very blunt about it, because people can't go out to the pub and plot. Because you understand that British politics takes place in pubs, really, and that high-level British politics takes place in expensive restaurants and expensive bars in London, where people plot and meet up with the people they're sleeping with, who are usually not their spouses. And this kind of activity has, been stopped. Well, as we know from recent events, not entirely stopped, but it has been stopped because of all the controls on movement. So this kind of internal tension within the Conservative Party has been put into deep storage, but I predict it's going to start reappearing pretty quickly, I think, in the next few months. And it's probably going to be resolved in about a year's time. And I think the outcome will be, I would bet that the outcome will be that the National Collectivists will win the fight there. Meanwhile, on the left in British politics, the Labour Party, like social democratic parties all over Europe, has this existential choice to make. Does it go down the route of being a left-wing form of national collectivism? Does it emphasize the left-wing economics, but also play up nationalism, try to develop a kind of left-wing patriotism? Or does it go down the route of radical identity politics, the kind of politics you were talking about? And woke, as it's called, although I don't like that term increasingly. And so if it goes, and there's going to be, again, the problem is all the really prominent figures in the media, the people who provide a lot of the energy in campaigning and organisation, they're on that radical left faction, but there aren't enough of them to win an election. That's the problem. The problem the left has is there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of ideas, there's a lot of dynamism, but they don't have enough voters. And in a democratic system, that's a killer. And so the Labour Party, I think, is going to continue to suffer serious travails, as social democratic parties throughout Europe are doing. The problem in the British case, of course, is we have a first past the post electoral system. So you can't do what you would do in a rational PR system and split the Labour Party into two different parties, at least, which would make a lot of sense, actually. And everyone would be a lot happier and get on a lot better, I think, if they did that. But they can't do it because of the way the electoral system works. Meanwhile, other things are going to be going on the left. And if the national collectivists do finally get definitive control of the Conservative Party's identity and agenda, which I have to say I think they will, the liberal Conservatives, if you will, they will start increasingly, I think, both voters and politicians, they'll start to migrate to other places, I think, and who knows how that will form, but I think that's what's going to happen. Yeah.
Well, Steve, this has been a very interesting and tremendously depressing conversation. But let me ask you a couple of other questions. First, I mean, we've been talking about parties and people's political posture. But of course, in the world we live in, a world where the state is so powerful and pervasive, and international organizations play quite a role, there is a class of people, whose mindset and whose ideas are particularly important, which is bureaucrats, functionaries. I mean, and of course, I mean, these people are very rarely libertarian, but for example, they tended to support international institutions as we knew them. Do you think the consensus among functionaries and bureaucrats is changing? Is their experts' view moving in a different direction? I mean, I do remember talking with some British civil servants, and I think, it was perhaps the single group of British citizens that were more anti-Brexit you could think of.
Yeah, indeed. As you say, that there is an extraordinarily powerful sort of like shared worldview amongst bureaucrats, for that one, functionaries everywhere. And I think that this worldview is an ideology in the classic original sense of the word, the way in which Friedrich Engels meant it to be understood, which is that it's a vision of the world which purports to be neutral and detached, but which actually serves the class interests of the people who have it, and grows out of the material conditions and interests they have, which shape their consciousness in a certain way, but it's a false consciousness. It doesn't accurately capture the world. So I think that, Engels, if he were to come back from the grave, would recognize this immediately, because it's exactly what he was talking about. And I think that the thing is, the people you're talking about, the functionaries, they are people who control the world and run the world through their position in large hierarchically structured organizations, which can be either public or private, because we're talking about senior management in very large companies are exactly the same mindset, same kind of people. Or in large charities, it's not just governments. And obviously these people love supranational organizations because they run them. And they see this as a way of dealing with problems that aren't capable of being dealt with at the lower level. And if you think about the ideology of the functionary class, what are some of the key elements? And I think there's two of them. One of them is a vision of politics as being about problem solving. It's a kind of project manager's view of politics, which is that politics throws up a series of discrete, concrete problems. And what you should be doing if you're in a functionary is to work out a way of resolving this problem. Okay? As I say, it's a kind of engineering or project manager's approach to politics. Mariana Mazzucato, for example, her most recent book about, I forget what she calls it now, but it's basically the idea that the way to go forward with government is to make the Apollo project our kind of template.
Mission-oriented political,
exactly.
industrial policy, moonshots, all of that.
That's right, moonshots, that's the name of the thing. And so that she's capturing that aspect of the ideology perfectly, I think, in that book. And the other part of it is that the key to this is expertise. And that what you have is a class of people who, by virtue of training and education, have more knowledge and therefore more expertise. And so therefore, they're the people who solve the problems for you. And this is the mentality of management scientists, of consultants, of project managers, engineers, and of bureaucrats worldwide. Now, that is not going to change, because given that it's an ideology, it's not the product of thought or intellectual conviction. It grows out of the way they live and what they do. It's a kind of rationalization or articulation of the kind of role that they have and the kind of social interest they have as a result. Now, I think that actually this worldview is going to be reasserted dramatically in the next few years. And you can see this in these kind of arguments that the Davos Forum has been coming up with for this great reset. And the kind of recent work of people like Bill Gates, as well as Mariana Mazzucato. And what Bill Gates and others like him are arguing for is essentially a kind of massive global response by both large governments and large firms to the perceived existential challenges of things like climate change and the like. And it's what they advocate is not anything like global communism. So people who say, oh, these people talk about global communist superstate. This is kind of ignorant rubbish, leave that for, American talk radio. What it is more is a kind of corporate oligarchy. That's what actually comes out of this rather than anything else. And that's the kind of top-down expert-driven politics that we're going to be seeing increasingly. I think Davos man, who is currently facing assaults from both the national collectivist right and the radical left, is going to rally round this kind of project politics, I think. What I would say, by the way, to that is that I wish there were more classical liberal brickbats being thrown at Davos man. I think this is a case where classical liberal scholars have fallen down. We should be, not that we share the same solutions as the national collectivists or the radical leftists, but we should also definitely agree with them that this whole approach of Davos man is seriously flawed, to put it mildly, and we should be joining them in hurling brickbats at them. So that, I think, is what's going to happen. Now, the other thing, though, is I think that what is going to happen in the next few years, I suspect, is that the whole idea of expertise and expert knowledge, which has already been on shaky foundations, is going to take a massive, massive hit. Partly because of the exploding problem of replicability in the sciences, particularly the social sciences, which has really gotten out of control, which has now escaped from the box. But also, I think, because of one particular issue, which is the growing suspicion that the virus and the pandemic were caused by a lab leak in China. Now, and the really explosive version is the version, it was a lab leak in China of a virus that had been enhanced by experimentation, what's called gain of function experiments. And this casts both the Chinese government and the American government, because they were funding the research of this lab in Wuhan, in an extremely bad light. But the people who are really, really in a bad light are the scientific establishment. Because it shows an extraordinary degree of arrogance and also sheer folly and lack of understanding of how probability works, that you engage in scientific research which has such incredibly catastrophic potential downsides, even if low probability. You just don't do that kind of stuff. Now, in a way, the truth, the reality, is irrelevant here. If it becomes widely believed, regardless of whether it's true or not, that this is what has happened, that we can blame scientific experts for the catastrophe of the pandemic, I think the effects are going to be seismic. And I think what it will do is it will hugely undermine the kind of expertise-based worldview of the scientific establishment and Davos man. And who knows how that will play out.
Yes, I mean, in a sense, when you were talking, I was thinking, we are in an Orwellian scenario, in the sense of, Orwell's criticism and fear for James Burnham managerial state.
Yeah.
I mean, this is exactly that sort of outlook. Okay, this is my last question. In this depressing and complicated world, I think we grew up, most of us, in a context in which people with classical liberal instincts were looking instinctively to the right. Where shall we look for in the future? I mean, is the prospect of an alliance with the conservative gone and dead? How can you think about making deals with the left? Since the radicals are so powerful.
My point is that is to ask the wrong question. I think that there was always something wrong with the idea of making alliances, because basically what that involves ultimately is Faustian bargains, selling your soul, and these never work out well, as Faust found out, of course. Maybe his maid saves him if you're Goethe, but most of the stories have him ending, with the devil demanding his price, and he goes off to the hot job. Now, what I think is what classical liberals should do is, first of all, remain loyal to their principles, develop their ideas, change them where necessary, but also apply those ideas and insights to changing conditions. And when you say look for allies, I think that's the wrong word, because that involves joining in a common project. Which is not what I think is going on. There's a classical liberal project. We're a very small in number, but that doesn't mean we should abandon the project we have, the vision we have. But what you do is you look for people you agree with on an issue by issue basis, and they will be all over the place. You may find that there are certain issues where you agree with the radical left. There may be other issues, one-off issues, where you agree with the centrists, as they're misleadingly called, I think. And there may yet be other issues where you agree with the national collectivists. Not many, I would think, but there might be one or two. And so I think the thing is to think, well, okay, do not ask ever, if you are a classical liberal intellectual or activist or scholar or whatever, do not ever ask, how will this play in Peoria? How will this, what should I think in terms of the political implications? You should just think, if I'm a liberal, I believe in liberal principles, what do I think about this? And then having done that, you may find, okay, who agrees with it? You may find, you've got people who agree with you in any part of the spectrum. And the thing is then, I think, to work with those people on an issue by issue basis. And so the idea that you're players in a big division and you have to ally yourself with one side or the other, I think that was a way of thinking which took root in the 1960s, actually, or maybe even earlier, the 1950s with Bill Buckley, which was a big mistake. And a mistake not only for classical liberals either. I think it's been a big mistake for Burkean conservatives and for certain kinds of social democrats. It has not worked. That's not the right way to go. So I think that's what we should do.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. It's been a great conversation, and thank you so much for
my pleasure
for doing this. And I hope we will have other chances, to go back to these themes, because clearly, the next 2-3 years are going to be very interesting indeed. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.